It's not like it's brain surgery. Okay, this lecture kind of is. We are going to look at the anatomy of the brain, be able to define myelination, gray matter, white matter, cranial nerve, brain, cortex, and reticular activating system. Be able to list the cranial nerves and assign functions to each one. List the lobes of the cerebrum and define functions of each. List the functional regions of the cortex and define their roles. And be able to list other parts of the brain, such as the midbrain and hindbrain, and define their roles. We're going to start off here by looking at a neuron, and what we see is myelination. If you don't remember myelination or you're a bit fuzzy, this might be a good time to look back at the neuron lecture. The myelin sheath is these oligodendrocytes or Schwann cells that are around the axon. They are fatty and they cause this saltatory conduction to take place where a nerve impulse will go down and jump between these nodes of Ranvier. And this makes this move faster. So as the signal moves faster with myelination, this increases the processing rate. This also makes the axons look white. If we're talking about nerves, these are actually bundles of myelinated axons. And the spinal cord especially has many myelinated axons. So this is what's going to cause white matter. The white matter here is the myelinated axons that go between the processing centers. The processing centers are the dendrites and cell bodies that are located in the gray matter. So if we're looking at both white matter and gray matter, white matter is primarily the axons that have been myelinated to move things faster. And gray matter is the dendrites and cell bodies where the actual processing takes place. Now let's look at some nerves. These are the cranial nerves. So these are going to various parts of the body, specifically mostly the head and neck, and they're going to come directly off of the brain. We have already looked at the nerves coming off of the spinal cord. So let's take a look through these. First off, the olfactory nerve. This is going to deal with the sense of smell. Next is the optic nerve, which is going to, as you might guess, deal with the sense of vision and move things towards the primary area that's going to be processed. Then we have the ocular motor nerve. That's going to coordinate eye movements. It's going to coordinate the constriction of the pupils and the position of the upper eyelid. The trochlear nerve allows a very specific muscle in the eye to allow your eyes to look down. Now just look down at your notes for a moment. Yep, that's a trochlear nerve right there. Your trigeminal nerve takes information from senses of 3 separate parts of the face. We're going to look at the beginning of your textbook's chapter. I think it's chapter 13 in my book. And that's going to be talking about trigeminal neuralgia and how Hemingway may have had trigeminal neuralgia, which may have caused flashes of pain in his trigeminal nerve. The abducens nerve is going to allow you to coordinate lateral eyeball movement. Look to your right, look to your left. That's right, you just used that nerve. The facial nerve allows you to make facial movements and coordinates the muscles in your face. It also receives information from taste on the front 2/3 of your tongue, as well as going to your lacrimal ducts to help you cry and express tears. Your vestibulocochlear nerve is going to branch into 2 separate nerves, one of which will be involved in hearing and the other of which will be involved in balance, both functions of the ears. The glossopharyngeal nerve is the taste on that last 1/3 of the tongue. Remember, the facial nerve is the first 2/3. The glossopharyngeal is the taste on the last 1/3. The glossopharyngeal nerve also aids in the swallowing. The vagus nerve is going to aid in digestion. It'll also going to coordinate your breathing rate and coordinate your heart rate. Good to coordinate both breathing and heart rate at the same time, eh? If you don't know why, I recommend you review the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system. The spinal accessory nerve is going to coordinate movements of the muscles that move your neck and your shoulders. So move that head around a little bit instead of looking side to side, and you are using your spinal accessory nerve. Last is the hypoglossal nerve. If you want to try to make this noise, that uses a hypoglossal nerve. It also allows you to move your mouth in order to speak and swallow. So you may have noticed a little bit of functional redundancy. That's because some of these nerves are going to be operating different parts of the same type of reflexes and movements. A lot of this does have functions in moving your eyes around and also, of course, swallowing and moving your mouth around, which makes sense because your eyes and your mouth are on your head and so is your cranium. So there we go. Let's look more specifically at the parts of the brain. So writ large, we have 3 parts of the brain: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. If you're going into developmental biology, this would be a good time to take a bit of a break and see how all of these are developed, because it's going to help you build a structure for how you're going to look at these. But if you're not going into developmental bio, hey, let's look at the brain. First off, the cerebrum. This is part of the forebrain, and it's going to have 4 parts of your cerebral cortex. So you can see the cerebral cortex here. We look at the 4 lobes, which just so happen to match with the 4 skull bones. The frontal lobe, which has the frontal bone above it, initiates motor activity and is responsible for speech and conscious thought. The temporal lobe is going to interpret auditory information. It's right under the temporal bone and near to your ears. It comprehends language and is involved in perceptual judgment, i.e. balance. The parietal lobe is under your parietal bone, which will interpret sensory information from the skin. Then we have the occipital lobe, which processes visual information. The optic nerve will be moving towards that. And we're going to look also at how this is 2 hemispheres. So there's the right hemisphere of the brain and the left hemisphere of the cerebrum. Sorry, cerebrum, not brain. And between these is a small connected area called the corpus callosum. So that corpus callosum allows the 2 sides of the brain to adequately communicate with one another. And the size of the corpus callosum is determined by the amount of testosterone in the body. More testosterone means less of a corpus callosum. So less of a corpus callosum is going to, of course, mean less communication between different parts of the body and a greater ability to compartmentalize things, as opposed to a greater ability to synthesize things, which happens with a larger corpus callosum. Now, if you look at the parietal and frontal lobe, the blue and red parts right there, you'll notice there's a spot right between them where they meet. And that is going to be important when we look at the different functional regions of the cerebral cortex. So these are the cortices here, and they are going to be important in very different roles. So we're kind of subdividing it into all of these. And for me, this is figure 1317 on page 288. It might be a different figure and page for you, but it is in your assigned book. Let's look through them. Starting with the prefrontal cortex, which is part of the frontal lobe. This gives us a sense of our relationship to the rest of the world, enabling us to think about it, plan, and execute appropriate behavior. So there's inhibitions going on here in the prefrontal cortex. And if you are a male of ages 17 or 18, your prefrontal cortex has not completed its development yet, which may give rise to a little bit of impulsivity. While that may make you great at the stock market, it tends to make bad decisions occur as well. Then you have Broca's area, generating a motor program for the muscles of speech. This is what determines how you are going to speak and how you are going to put your words together. The motor association area is where neurons plan a program for the contraction of muscles required for something like dancing, typing, or speaking. The primary motor cortex is where your neurons send signals for precise, finely coordinated limb movements. So you may have noticed there the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe right next to each other are those two, that precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus, because in the postcentral gyrus, the primary somesthesic or somatosensory cortex is your touch, pain, and temperature. Looking back to that parietal lobe, sensory information is from the skin. Looking at the primary somatosensory cortex, senses from the skin. Then the somesthesic association area interprets that information and makes a cognitive sense of it. What does it mean? Wernicke's area is the recognition of spoken or written language. Visual association area recognizes faces and other familiar objects. And you see that's a rather large area. Then the primary visual cortex of the occipital lobe receives visual signals. So you see a reception and a recognition area here. Your primary auditory cortex in the temporal lobe will receive auditory signals, but you need the Wernicke area for the recognition of spoken and written language. The auditory association area recognizes signals received as spoken words, a familiar piece of music, or a voice. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. I'm in your auditory association area, recognizing those signals as a familiar piece of music from the McDonald's ad, which may lead you eventually to the primary gustatory cortex, which receives gustatory, yum yum, taste signals. Looking at this from a learning sense, if you merely look at slides, you're only giving that information to the occipital lobe, and that does not help you learn things as well as if you put it in other parts of your brain. What you need to do is you need to look at something and use your occipital lobe, recognize it as spoken and written language in your Wernicke area, translate it to kind of what it means, and then use your Broca's area for muscles of speech to kind of put it in your own words, and use your motor association areas to write this down or type it. This is why something so simple as just listening to a podcast, which only goes through the primary auditory cortex and auditory association area, and of course Wernicke's area, is very different than listening to a podcast and writing things down. Remember, learning requires a lot of different interactions in the gray matter of your brain. So the more you process, the better your memories will be. Use your whole brain to learn. The thalamus. Okay, the thalamus is a relay center for everything except smell. Remember that olfactory nerve goes directly to the brain. And then we have the hypothalamus, which maintains homeostasis. Too warm, too cold, use your hypothalamus. The pituitary gland is important in hormone regulation, and this is important to be below the hypothalamus because there are roles of the pituitary gland in homeostasis as well. Let's move on to the midbrain. This is going to be pretty simple. We're looking at how it receives information and relays it, which is everything except scent, which is going to be coming through your olfactory nerve. Midbrain also coordinates peripheral vision reflex, turning your head towards movement, which is going to, of course, require certain nerves. Which nerves? Maybe look back at your cranial nerves. Last, the hindbrain. We have the pons and medulla, which will transfer information from the peripheral nervous system. So you can see here the spinal cord coming up, and it goes through the pons and medulla. And as it goes to the pons medulla, it will translate that information and process it properly and put it to the proper part of the forebrain. The cerebellum coordinates large-scale body movements, such as running or climbing. If you're a bit of a klutz, blame your cerebellum. The medulla oblongata moderates homeostasis in coordination with part of the midbrain, and that is also going to coordinate the blood vessel activity and your digestion. Last up on the hindbrain, the reticular formation and the reticular activating system. The reticular formation receives all incoming and outgoing information and will monitor the activity of what is all coming in and what is all going out. The reticular activating system, on the other hand, actually uses this information as well as visual impulses and auditory impulses to keep us awake and alert. Hopefully you haven't fallen asleep during this lecture, and if you do, you can either blame me, which is fair, or blame your reticular activating system.